What if the most reliable bodyguards in history were the men least likely to betray you precisely because they had nothing to gain by doing so? Emotion value 10/picture this. Constantinople, 988 CE. Emperor Basil the Second stands in his palace, surrounded by plots. His own generals have turned against him. Vardas Phocas, a Byzantine nobleman with deep connections throughout the aristocracy, has gathered an army of men who speak the emperor's language, worship in his churches, and understand exactly which cousin to bribe, which general to flatter, which senator to threaten. The rebellion grows stronger by the day. And Basil's solution. He sends word to the frozen north. Emotion value 10/ he asks for Vikings. 6,000 of them arrive that year. Fur-clad warriors from the frigid lands of the Kievan Rus, men who worship strange gods, speak incomprehensible tongues, and have never set foot in the gleaming streets of the world's greatest city. They carry massive axes that Byzantine soldiers have never seen before. They stand taller than most men in the empire. They look absolutely terrifying. But here is the paradox that would define Byzantine security for the next 4 centuries. These foreigners, these complete outsiders, would become the most trusted men in the empire, not despite their foreignness, but precisely because of it. Stop and think about that for a moment. In a court where everyone spoke Greek, these men spoke Norse. In a city where everyone understood the intricate web of family alliances and political obligations, these men knew nothing of local feuds. In an empire where ambitious generals had overthrown emperors for centuries, these warriors had no ambitions that could threaten the throne. They wanted gold and glory, not power. They wanted adventure, not influence. They wanted exactly what the emperor could provide without compromising his own position. The logic seems counterintuitive until you think about it carefully. Every Byzantine nobleman had family ties that could be exploited. Every Greek general had political ambitions that could be awakened. Every local soldier had relatives who might be threatened, ancestral lands that might be confiscated, religious loyalties that might be manipulated. The web of Byzantine politics was so intricate, so ancient, so impossibly complex, that no one born within it could ever be truly free of its threads. The Varangians had none of these vulnerabilities. They could not be bribed with promises of land they did not want. They could not be threatened through family members living thousands of miles away in Scandinavia. They had no understanding of the complex religious controversies that tore at Byzantine society, the debates over icons and images that had split the empire for generations. They could not be recruited into palace conspiracies because they literally could not understand the conversations happening around them. They existed outside the system entirely, which made them the only men who could be trusted inside the emperor's innermost chambers. The 8 term itself reveals the nature of the arrangement. Varangian comes from the Old Norse word varangi, meaning sworn companion or pledge of fidelity, someone bound by oath rather than blood or land. These were men who had chosen their loyalty freely, and, having chosen, would maintain it absolutely. In a court where allegiance shifted with the political winds, where brothers murdered brothers and sons plotted against fathers, this chosen loyalty became the most valuable commodity in the empire. Think about it from a modern perspective. How many corporate security firms specifically recruit from outside their clients' industries? How many governments trust foreign-born soldiers with their most sensitive operations precisely because those soldiers cannot be compromised by domestic political pressure? The Varangian model did not die with Constantinople. It simply evolved into forms we would recognize today. Emotion value tense death, but the Varangians were not merely hired for their political neutrality. They were hired because they were absolutely terrifying in combat. Imagine standing in formation as Byzantine infantry. watching the Varangian Guard approach. The ground seems to tremble beneath their boots. Their primary weapon was the pelekys, a Danish battle axe measuring 140 centimeters from butt to blade, with an 18-centimeter head and 17-centimeter blade width. These were not weapons designed for finesse. They were not elegant swords meant for dueling. They were instruments of devastation, designed to crash through shields, shatter helmets, and cleave armored men in half with single strokes. Wielded two-handed by warriors who had grown up using such weapons since childhood, the pelekys made the Varangians the most devastating close-quarters fighters in the medieval world. The Byzantine Greeks even developed a special term for these warriors. They called them pelekys, which simply means axe-bearers. The weapon had become so synonymous with the guard that it defined their very identity in the Greek language. When Byzantine chroniclers wrote about the pelekys, everyone knew exactly who they meant. The towering Northmen with their massive two-handed axes, standing guard outside the emperor's chambers, ready to split anyone who approached without permission. Emotion value tense/Byzantine writers struggled to describe the impression these warriors made on those who encountered them. One chronicler noted that the Varangians were frightening both in appearance and in equipment. Another recorded that they cheerfully hacked anyone the emperor ordered them to kill. That word, cheerfully, reveals something important about the Varangian character. These were not reluctant soldiers doing their duty out of obligation. These were not conscripts forced into service against their will. These were men who had traveled thousands of miles specifically to find opportunities for glory and gold in battle. When the emperor pointed at an enemy and said, "Kill," the Varangians treated it as a gift, an opportunity to demonstrate their worth and earn their pay. Can you imagine the psychological impact on the emperor's enemies, knowing that any attempt on his life would be met not by politically compromised palace guards, but by genuine Vikings who viewed combat as recreation, knowing that these guards could not be bought, could not be threatened, could not be reasoned with in any language they understood? The Varangians were not just protection. They were deterrents made flesh, walking warnings to anyone who contemplated assassination or rebellion. Their armor complemented their fearsome weapons in ways that maximized both protection and intimidation. Standard Varangian equipment included 30 pounds of ringmail reinforced with lamellar or scale armor, creating layers of metallic defense that could stop most blade strikes while remaining flexible enough for the violent movements of axe combat. Conical helmets protected their heads, often decorated with horsehair plumes that marked their unit affiliations and waved dramatically during movement. Mail eventails guarded their necks and shoulders, protecting vulnerable areas that a battle axe might expose during the swing. Most distinctively, they wore a leather chest harness that Byzantine observers called the Varangian bra, a piece of equipment that distributed the weight of their armor and weapons across their shoulders and torso, allowing them to fight for hours without exhaustion. This seemingly unglamorous piece of equipment reveals the professional sophistication of Varangian warfare. They understood that battles were won not just by initial ferocity, but by endurance, by the ability to keep fighting when lesser warriors collapsed from exhaustion. Everything about their appearance was designed to intimidate. Everything about their equipment was designed to kill efficiently over extended periods. And beneath this intimidating exterior lay genuine military professionalism that would have impressed any modern soldier. The Varangians were not mindless berserkers charging into battle without thought. They could form disciplined lines that held under pressure while other units broke and fled. They could execute complex maneuvers requiring coordination and communication despite speaking different languages than their Byzantine commanders. They could fight as infantry in set-piece battles, as cavalry when horses were available, or as naval marines during amphibious operations depending on the tactical situation. Their versatility made them valuable far beyond the palace walls. An emperor could send his Varangians anywhere, confident they would perform any military task required with efficiency and determination. Entry into the Varangian Guard was not simple. Candidates had to pay a substantial gold fee just for the opportunity to be evaluated, ensuring that only the wealthiest and most capable warriors joined. This financial barrier served multiple purposes that reveal Byzantine sophistication in managing mercenary forces. It guaranteed that Varangians had resources to lose if they betrayed their oath, creating material incentive for loyalty. It ensured they came from successful warrior families who had taught them proper fighting techniques. And it created an elite status that the guards fiercely protected against dilution. The evaluation process itself was rigorous. Candidates had to demonstrate proficiency with their traditional weapons. They had to prove physical fitness sufficient for the demanding duties ahead. They had to show they understood the basic requirements of guard duty even if they could not speak Greek. This was not a refuge for desperate men with nowhere else to go. This was an elite institution that selected only the best from among those who could afford to apply. When Emperor Basil sent them against Varda's Phocas, the Varangians proved their worth immediately and spectacularly. The rebel forces, composed of Byzantine soldiers with local loyalties and political motivations, found themselves facing warriors who had no interest in negotiation, no susceptibility to political persuasion, and absolutely no hesitation about killing fellow Christians. The Varangians did not care about the theological disputes that divided Byzantine factions. They did not understand the complex inheritance claims that motivated aristocratic rebellions. They understood only that the emperor had paid them to fight, and fight they did. The rebellion collapsed within months. Basil secured his throne against a threat that had seemed overwhelming just a year earlier. The Varangian Guard became a permanent institution that would outlast the emperor who founded it by more than 4 centuries. The numbers fluctuated dramatically over those centuries. Emperor Basil started with approximately 6,000 Viking warriors. During the 11th century, the Guard's strength varied wildly depending on imperial campaigns and financial circumstances, ranging anywhere from 4,500 men during major operations to as few as 540 during lean periods. By the late 13th century, official strength had stabilized around 3,000 men, though even that number represented a fraction of the original force that had saved Basil's throne. But perhaps no single figure better illustrates the Varangian experience than Harold Sigurdsson, later known to history as Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, the last Viking. Emotion value: tense/picture a young Norwegian prince arriving in Constantinople around 1015, exiled from his homeland after a failed bid for the throne. Harald had nothing but his sword arm and his ambition. He had been driven from Norway by political enemies after his half-brother King Olaf fell in battle. He had wandered across the Baltic lands, seeking opportunities for service and glory. He had arrived in the greatest city in the world with only his reputation as a fighter and his dreams of eventual return to claim his rightful crown. He joined the Varangian Guard as one warrior among thousands. Within decades, he would become the most famous Viking of his generation, a man whose exploits would be celebrated in sagas across Scandinavia for centuries. Harald's career reads like adventure fiction, except every detail is documented in Byzantine and Scandinavian sources that corroborate each other across linguistic and cultural boundaries. He fought across Sicily, leading Varangian Marines in amphibious assaults against Muslim strongholds that had resisted Byzantine reconquest for generations. The heat must have been overwhelming for men raised in Norwegian winters. The terrain must have seemed alien beyond imagination. Yet Harald and his fellow Varangians adapted, fighting with the same ferocity under Mediterranean sun that their ancestors had shown in northern forests. He campaigned across Anatolia, the Byzantine heartland, suppressing bandits and defending frontier towns against Turkish raiders. These were unglamorous missions, far from the epic battles celebrated in saga poetry. Yet they represented the daily reality of Varangian service. Most of their time was spent on patrols, garrison duty, and small-scale engagements rather than the dramatic sieges that made the chronicles. He carried Byzantine banners into Iraq, fighting in territories that modern armies would struggle to reach, earning reputation and wealth in lands far from his northern homeland. By the time he finished his service, Harold had personally participated in the capture of 80 Arab strongholds. 80. Each victory added to his reputation. Each campaign added to his wealth. Each battle carved his name deeper into the chronicles of his age. Emotion value 10/in 1041. The Varangian Guard faced a different kind of challenge that tested their famous neutrality. Peter Delian had launched a Bulgarian uprising against Byzantine rule, threatening to tear away territory the empire had spent generations conquering. The Bulgarians were Christians, fellow Orthodox believers who shared many cultural connections with Byzantium. Byzantine troops might have hesitated to suppress them with full force. Political considerations might have moderated violence. Religious sympathies might have created opportunities for negotiation and compromise. The Varangians had no such hesitations. They were sent to suppress the rebellion, and they did so with characteristic thoroughness that earned them both fear and respect. Harold earned the title Devastator of the Bulgarians that year, a sobriquet that would follow him for the rest of his life and appear in chronicles from Constantinople to Reykjavik. The title tells you everything about how the Varangians approached their duties. They did not discriminate between enemies. They did not engage in political calculation about future relations. They devastated whoever the emperor told them to devastate. His success brought him to the highest ranks of the imperial bodyguard. Harold achieved the position of Manglabites, placing him within the emperor's innermost circle of protectors, one of the few men permitted to be armed in the imperial presence. He had risen from exiled prince to one of the most powerful foreigners in the Byzantine world. He had access to the emperor's person. He commanded respect throughout the military establishment. He had accumulated enough gold to finance kingdoms. And then, loaded with gold and glory, he left. Here is the thing about Varangian service that made it unique in medieval military history. It was openly transactional. The Varangians did not pretend to serve out of love for Byzantium or devotion to Orthodox Christianity. They served for gold, for glory, and for the opportunity to eventually return home as wealthy men. The empire accepted this arrangement because transactional loyalty, paradoxically, proved more reliable than ideological loyalty in the treacherous environment of Byzantine politics. Consider the alternative. A soldier who claims to serve out of belief might change his beliefs when exposed to persuasive arguments. A general who claims to serve out of patriotism might decide that true patriotism requires removing a corrupt emperor. A nobleman who serves out of family tradition might find his family's interests diverging from the throne when marriage alliances shift. But a mercenary who serves for gold will remain loyal as long as the gold flows. His motivations are transparent, predictable, and therefore manageable. What lesson does this teach about human nature? Perhaps that honesty about self-interest creates more stable relationships than dishonest claims of selflessness. The Varangian standing guard outside the emperor's bedchamber was not pretending to be motivated by anything other than his contract. Everyone understood the arrangement, and understanding, in that deadly court, was the foundation of trust. Harold returned to Norway and became king. He eventually died at Stamford Bridge in 1066. Leading the last great Viking invasion of England, cut down by an English arrow just weeks before William the Conqueror landed at Hastings to reshape European history forever. But his story illustrates a pattern that repeated thousands of times across Varangian history. Young warriors arrived poor and ambitious, served with exceptional loyalty, accumulated wealth and reputation, and eventually returned to their homelands as transformed men. The Varangian Guard was not merely a military unit. It was a career path, an institution that turned Nordic ambition into Byzantine security while creating future kings and nobles across Scandinavia. But the Varangians served functions far beyond ceremonial protection and battlefield glory. Their duties extended into areas that modern observers might find surprising or disturbing, revealing the full scope of imperial power that they represented. Emotion value 10/The Varangians policed Constantinople's streets, enforcing imperial law among a population that had no love for these foreign giants. They arrested political opponents of the emperor, dragging senators and generals from their beds in midnight raids to face imperial justice. They served as prison guards, watching over the empire's most dangerous captives in dungeons beneath the Great Palace. They practiced specialized torture techniques, extracting confessions from suspected traitors using methods that Byzantine officials considered beneath their dignity but necessary for the empire's security. Beyond the palace walls, Varangian duties included anti-piracy naval operations in light vessels called Auci, hunting down the raiders who plagued Byzantine shipping lanes throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea. These maritime missions took them far from Constantinople, operating in small units rather than the massed formations of their land battles. The skills required were different from axe combat, demanding navigation, seamanship, and the ability to board enemy vessels in the chaos of naval engagements. Yet the Varangians adapted, demonstrating the versatility that made them valuable far beyond their original role as bodyguards. Were these activities compatible with the image of noble Viking warriors celebrated in saga poetry? Perhaps not. But the Varangians understood something important about their role. They were tools of imperial power. And power sometimes requires ugly work. The same qualities that made them excellent bodyguards also made them excellent enforcers. They had no connections to the people they arrested. They had no sympathy for the political causes of the men they tortured. They could not be bribed or intimidated by local power networks. They could do what needed to be done without hesitation or remorse. Does this make them villains? Or simply professionals doing a difficult job? The answer probably depends on your perspective. To the Byzantine emperors, the Varangians were indispensable servants who kept the empire safe through necessary means. To the political prisoners in those dungeons, they were monsters without mercy or understanding. To the Varangians themselves, they were simply men fulfilling their contracts, doing what they had agreed to do in exchange for gold and opportunity. This did not mean they were without their own code, their own traditions that predated their Byzantine service and continued throughout their centuries in Constantinople. When an emperor died, they exercised an ancient rite called pelekys, literally palace pillaging. Each Varangian was permitted to take as much gold from the imperial treasury as both hands could carry. This was not seen as theft but as rightful compensation, a final bonus for years of loyal service. The practice horrified Byzantine officials but remained accepted throughout the Guard's history because the alternative was worse. Better to lose some gold than to face angry Varangians who felt cheated of their due. Picture that scene for a moment. The emperor has died. The palace is in mourning. Courtiers weep and pray. Priests chant the liturgy for the dead. And through the corridors march the Varangians, their eyes fixed on the treasury, their massive hands ready to grab as much gold as they can carry. It seems almost barbaric, a violation of solemn ceremony. Yet this tradition survived for centuries because everyone understood its purpose. It bound Varangian loyalty to each successive emperor rather than to the office or the state. The Varangians also loved Greek wine with an enthusiasm that became legendary throughout Constantinople and beyond. They were nicknamed the Emperor's wineskins by locals who watched them stagger through the streets after celebrations. Byzantine sources record that Greek wine affected these northern warriors particularly strongly. perhaps because they were accustomed to mead and ale rather than the potent vintages of the Mediterranean. At least twice in recorded history, drunken Varangians actually assaulted emperors they were supposed to protect. The incidents were handled quietly, the guilty parties presumably punished. But the pattern revealed an important truth. The Varangians were human beings with human weaknesses, not merely perfect killing machines. How do you reconcile these contradictions? Men who would die for the emperor but might also drunkenly punch him. Loyal guards who would plunder the treasury the moment their master died? The answer lies in understanding that Varangian loyalty was specific and contractual. They swore to protect the emperor while he lived and paid them. They did not swear eternal devotion to the Byzantine state or the imperial family. When an emperor died, the contract ended and new terms were negotiated with his successor. When the wine flowed, their duty technically continued, but their judgment faltered. The boundaries of their loyalty were clearly defined, and those boundaries sometimes created surprising situations. This contractual understanding also explains what happened when the Varangian Guard finally faced its limits. Emotion value tent/that the Battle of Dyrrhachion in 1081. The Varangians encountered Norman cavalry under Robert Guiscard in one of the most dramatic confrontations of medieval military history. The Normans were themselves descendants of Vikings, warriors who had settled in France and adopted the cavalry tactics that dominated Western European warfare. They knew how to fight against infantry armed with axes because their ancestors had carried similar weapons. The battle became a disaster for the Varangians. Norman knights devastated their formations with repeated cavalry charges, using lance and horse to break through the axe-armed infantry before they could close to effective range. The Guard suffered catastrophic losses that day, demonstrating that even the finest warriors can be defeated by tactical innovation. Emotion value tent/sput more revealing was what happened during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Western Crusaders, supposedly allies of Byzantium who had been transported to the Holy Land on Byzantine ships, turned against Constantinople itself. The city faced siege by armies it had helped equip and transport. Venetian greed and Crusader ambition combined to assault the greatest Christian city in the world. And the Varangians, those legendary defenders of the emperor, those men who had cheerfully hacked enemies for over 2 centuries, simply left. Why? Because the payments stopped. The Byzantine treasury was empty. The emperors could no longer meet their obligations to their foreign guards. And the Varangian contract, that foundation of their legendary loyalty, became void. No gold meant no service. It was that simple. Some might see this as proof of mercenary unreliability. But consider the alternative interpretation. The Varangians had never pretended to be anything other than professional soldiers serving for compensation. When their employers could no longer honor the agreement, they were free to seek employment elsewhere. The betrayal, if any, came from the Byzantine state that had promised payment and failed to deliver. The Varangians had kept their end of the bargain for centuries. They could hardly be blamed when their employers could not do the same. After 1204, the Varangian Guard never recovered its former glory. The restored Byzantine Empire that emerged from the Latin occupation was smaller, poorer, and less capable of maintaining elite mercenary forces. The Varangians continued to exist, but their role shifted from active military service to palace and prison duties. Numbers declined dramatically from the thousands to the hundreds. Where once 6,000 warriors had served Emperor Basil, later periods saw contingents of 540 or 300 or even fewer, depending on imperial finances. The institution that had defined Byzantine security for 2 centuries became a shadow of itself. The ethnic composition also shifted over time in ways that reveal the international nature of the Guard. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 had unexpected consequences for the Varangian Guard. Anglo-Saxon warriors, displaced from their homeland by William the Conqueror, began seeking opportunities abroad. Many of them found their way to Constantinople, following in the footsteps of countless mercenaries before them. By the late 11th century, Anglo-Saxons dominated Varangian ranks alongside the original Scandinavian warriors. The Guard became a refuge for dispossessed fighting men from across Northern Europe, united not by ethnicity but by professional commitment. This transformation raises interesting questions about identity and loyalty. Were these Anglo-Saxon refugees truly Varangians in the original sense? They had not come from the Norse tradition that gave the Guard its name. They spoke different languages, followed different customs, and had different motivations for service. Yet they performed the same functions, followed the same traditions, and maintained the same contractual relationship with the empire. Perhaps being Varangian was less about ethnic origin than about professional commitment. Perhaps it was a job description rather than an identity. The final documented mention of the Varangian Guard comes from 1404, when the chronicler Adam of Usk visited Constantinople and observed what remained of the institution. By then, the Guard had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. The mighty Viking warriors of Basil's era had become a small ceremonial force guarding a dying empire. The axes still gleamed, but they no longer inspired terror. 49 years later, Constantinople would fall to Ottoman cannons. The walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years proved inadequate against gunpowder artillery. The military traditions that had sustained Byzantine power became obsolete overnight. The Varangian Guard, whatever remained of it, disappeared into history along with the empire it had served. The last chapter closed on an institution that had defined elite military service for over 4 centuries. But the model they established did not disappear. Sound familiar? To today, we call them private military contractors. Companies like Blackwater, now operating under different names after various scandals and reorganizations, recruit soldiers without local political connections to provide security in conflict zones around the world. Their employees come from dozens of countries precisely because foreign origins prevent local compromises. The logic is identical to Basil's decision in 988. Outsiders cannot be manipulated by insider politics. Outsiders have no family to threaten, no tribal loyalties to exploit, no political ambitions to awaken. The French Foreign Legion follows the same principle with remarkable fidelity to the original Varangian model. Non-citizens serving under French command, bound by contracts rather than patriotism, granted citizenship after honorable service completion. Like the Varangians, legionnaires are valued for their distance from the societies they protect. Their foreignness becomes their qualification. Their outsider status becomes their security clearance. Even the Swiss Guard protecting the Vatican represents a continuation of the Varangian tradition across half a millennium. Foreign soldiers guarding a religious leader, bound by professional commitment rather than local allegiance, maintaining centuries-old traditions in modern contexts. The halberds have replaced battle axes. The uniforms have changed, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Trust the outsider, because he has nothing to gain from betrayal except what you have agreed to pay him. What does this tell us about the nature of loyalty itself? Perhaps the Varangians understood something that more idealistic military traditions have struggled to accept. Loyalty built on transparent self-interest may be more reliable than loyalty built on claimed beliefs. The Varangian who served for gold knew exactly what he was getting and what he owed in return. The relationship was clear to everyone involved. The ideological soldier who claims to serve for honor or faith may discover that his ideology permits changing sides when circumstances change. He may reinterpret his principles to justify whatever action benefits him. He may convince himself that betrayal serves a higher purpose. Or perhaps the lesson is darker. Perhaps the Varangians demonstrate that all loyalty is ultimately transactional, and the only difference is whether the transaction is acknowledged openly or disguised behind rhetoric. Byzantine emperors who trusted their Varangian guards knew exactly what they were purchasing. Byzantine emperors who trusted ideologically motivated generals often discovered too late that those generals had redefined ideology to suit their ambitions. Perhaps honest mercenaries are safer than dishonest patriots. The Varangian Guard protected Byzantine emperors for over 400 years. During that time, they fought in countless battles, suppressed numerous rebellions, and maintained security in the most dangerous court in the medieval world. They did so not through devotion to Byzantine culture or Orthodox faith, but through a simple agreement: gold for service, protection for payment, axes for anyone who threatened the arrangement. That they left when payment stopped does not diminish their accomplishment. It merely reveals its nature. The Varangians were exactly what they claimed to be: nothing more and nothing less, in a world of hidden agendas and disguised motivations. That transparency may have been their greatest virtue. When Emperor Basil hired 6,000 Vikings to be his personal bodyguards, he was not engaging in desperation. He was making a calculated decision based on understanding human nature. The most loyal guards are those with no stake in the empire they protect, because their loyalty becomes transactional purity rather than ideological compromise. They cannot be corrupted by what they do not want. They cannot be threatened through connections they do not have. They cannot be turned against you by enemies who cannot speak their language. The axe-wielding giants from the frozen north understood this truth. They never pretended otherwise. And for 4 centuries, that honest understanding kept emperors alive in a court where pretense usually proved fatal. To a T. As governments and corporations continue to grapple with questions of security and loyalty, the Varangian model remains relevant. Who can you trust when everyone around you has hidden motivations? Perhaps the answer is counterintuitive. Trust the person whose motivations are openly declared, whose interests are clearly defined, and whose contract is honestly acknowledged. Trust the professional who admits he serves for compensation rather than the ideologue who claims to serve for principle. The Vikings who guarded Constantinople were many things. They were fearsome warriors who terrified enemies with their massive axes and their enthusiasm for combat. They were enthusiastic drinkers whose love of Greek wine became legendary. They were pragmatic professionals who understood that service requires payment and loyalty requires honesty. They were foreign, strange, and terrifying to those who faced them in battle. But above all, they were exactly what they appeared to be. In the treacherous waters of medieval politics, where everyone wore masks and every promise concealed potential betrayal, that may have been the rarest quality of all. The Varangians offered emperors something no Byzantine could provide: certainty about what they wanted and honesty about why they served. 4 centuries later, we are still looking for the same thing.